Labeling Vladimir Putin a killer, accusing China of genocide against the Uyghur people, the Biden administration has taken off the gloves when it comes to relations with two of the U.S. main rivals. With harsh rhetoric against Russia and China, the new U.S. president's apparently looking to make good on his pledge that America is back and won't be pushed around. Both rivals responded promptly and angrily. How prepared is the U.S. for dramatic deterioration in relations? And will America's allies go along? Biden confronts Russia and China, but can the U.S. win? Welcome to the Point. It's a pleasure to greet our guests. Matthew Karnitschnig is from the U.S. magazine Politico, and he says Biden's foreign policy course won't lead to confrontation. It will help the world avoid one by making clear to both China and Russia where the red lines are. It's great to have Malte Lehming with us once again. He's from the Berlin daily Der Tagesspiegel, and his opinion: if all three big powers abandon any sense of caution, then a very messy escalation could follow. And it's a pleasure to welcome Hang-Shuen from DW's Asia desk. She thinks China's wolf warrior diplomacy is a mistake. The more aggressive it gets, the closer the West will be drawn together. So, Matthew, you talk in your opening statement about red lines. And as we all know, red lines can become an embarrassment for a leader who doesn't follow up with deeds. So let me ask all of you, but I'll start with Matthew. How surprised have you been at the harsh rhetoric coming from Joe Biden and his administration? And is there a risk that they're overshooting the mark?
I personally don't think that they're overshooting the mark. I haven't been surprised because I think that over the past several years, there's been a lot of question about what U.S. foreign policy is and what matters to the United States when it comes to these issues. And I think this was really the goal that Biden was pursuing with this, to say, you know, we do have values, we're going to fight for these values, we're going to stand up for these values globally, and to make clear that what we've seen over the past several years is an anomaly, and that it's not all just about trade, it's not all just about making money, that the United States is still going to stand up for people's rights, for human rights, when it thinks it's necessary. So I think that the real audience was not so much the regime in Beijing or Vladimir Putin, but the public at large, the global public, as it were.
So Biden essentially saying he's the not Trump. Hang-Shuen, what do you think? Were you surprised at the harshness of this rhetoric, and do you think it's overshooting?
I was both surprised and not surprised. Not surprised in the sense that because Biden has already made it very clear before he became president that that both parties will have to be harsh on China. So he already said that. So I wasn't surprised that the rhetoric has become so harsh, but I was also a little bit surprised in the sense that the meeting in Alaska, the way that they spoke to each other in such a blunt way, a clear way, I was actually a little bit surprised by that. And I think it's important for the U.S., it was an important step for the U.S. to actually make it clear to its audience in the domestic market, so to say, in the U.S., and also to the audience in the EU, that the U.S. is back. I think it was a right step for the U.S. to do.
And we're going to take a look at that meeting in Anchorage in a moment. But first of all, same question to you, Malte. Were you surprised? And what do you think about overshooting?
I was a little surprised. I mean, in international politics and security questions, there is sometimes a difference between being right and being wise. You can be right about calling Vladimir Putin a killer, or I would doubt that the gross and harsh human rights violation already is something like a genocide. But even that, the question is it wise to do it? What purpose does it serve? And if you, on one hand, serve the rhetoric of the Communist Chinese Party, because they say what the West is doing. It's an unsuccessful regime. What the only weapon they have is the morality, and they try to have the moral supremacy about our system by pointing to that. It might feed just the rhetoric without any consequence. If you afterwards sit down with them and talk business, then what kind of aim are you following with that?
And we want to talk in a moment about whether it's still possible to talk business then. Particularly in the wake of the January attack on the U.S. Capitol, both Russia and China have depicted the U.S. as weakened by political divisions, pandemic mismanagement, and economic instability. Biden's reassertion of America's moral authority appears designed to prove those accusations wrong, even at the price of increasingly bitter relations.
It's the first meeting of top US and Chinese diplomats of the Biden era. The mood is frosty.
We'll also discuss our deep concerns with actions by China, including in Xinjiang, Hong Kong, Taiwan, cyber attacks on the United States, economic coercion toward our allies. Each of these actions threaten the rules-based order that maintains global stability.
In response, China brings up racism in the US, rejecting any interference in its domestic affairs. Our hope is that when talking about universal values or international public opinion, the US side will think about whether it feels entitled to say those things, because it does not represent the world, it only represents the government of the United States. 2 days earlier, Joe Biden made serious accusations against the Russian president in a television interview.
You know Vladimir Putin, you think he's a killer?
Mm-hmm, I do.
So what price must he pay?
The price he's going to pay, well, you'll see shortly.
The US president didn't clarify whether he was alluding to the poisoning of Russian opposition leader Alexei Navalny. The response from Moscow was calm. As Biden said, we know each other personally. What would I reply to him? I would say, I wish you health. I say that without any irony. But what is Joe Biden hoping to achieve with this harsh rhetoric?
Matthew, I want to pass that question right on to you. You said clearly Biden's signaling he's the non-Trump. But beyond that, what is he looking to achieve and what is he likely to achieve?
Well, I think one of the main goals he has is to bring other Western allies on board to the U.S. position on China. And I think that is something where he's actually already had some progress, because there had been divisions within sort of the Western alliance about how to approach China and whether to look the other way in the face of abuses like the ones against the Uyghurs and others. And I think part of this is really directed at Europe in particular, to say, we need you to come with us as we approach China going forward, because there's been a wholesale repositioning, I would say, of the United States strategy towards China that began under Trump already, a realization that the wealth that China now has and that it has built up over the last 20 or 30 years is not going to result in a more democratic China, which is what many liberals in the West had hoped. And there's, I think, broad consensus now in the United States and in much of Europe that that's just not going to happen. China is an authoritarian state, and we need to be prepared for the consequences of that and act accordingly. And I think this is what his mission is.
Hang-Shuen, let's talk a little bit about what the Chinese reaction was. We heard after those meetings in Alaska from the American side that behind closed doors, the tone was more civil. What did Chinese leadership have to say about the tone behind closed doors, if anything?
Well, I think for China, they didn't expect it to be that the tone would have been so harsh. And I think for China, it is now clear that the U.S. is not going to be its ally. I think because before the meeting, there were still a little bit of hopes that the U.S. might actually still be its allies, because it's Biden after all. It's not Trump. It's like a little bit more predictable, maybe, that he might be a little bit more. He might go a little bit more like the usual diplomatic track. But then I think after this meeting, it's just very clear that the U.S. it's not going down that route. That it's going to compete with China.
And what are you hearing from China in terms of whether they think it will remain as confrontational as it apparently was in Anchorage? Will there, in fact, be more trade war, more trade conflict, essentially more of the Trump approach?
I think China is ready. It is ready for that, and especially because of this wolf warrior diplomacy that it already has been trying to do since 2017. It has increasingly been harsh on other neighbors when they were attacked, and they have tried to try to show. The Chinese people that China is now strong, that it can compete with the Western neighbors. And I think China is going down that route, that it's focusing much more on the domestic market, that it's driving itself away from cooperation with the West, but try to look into the domestic market. How can people from what do Chinese people think about China? It's much more important for them.
Malte, Biden himself has repeatedly said that there are certain topics and areas on which the U.S. must cooperate with Russia and China, be it arms control, be it climate change. Do you think that a pragmatic approach that oscillates between confrontation and cooperation is actually still possible side by side with this maximum pressure rhetoric?
It is maximum pressure. There's nothing in international relationship that is more powerful than accusing someone of committing genocide. This is the strongest language ever. On the other hand, I strongly hope that both sides, the Chinese and the Americans, do know what you just said, that they have to cooperate on climate, on a lot of topics. So I think that the Chinese side knows very well that it is more or less pure symbolism, rhetoric symbolism, what is said. Because on one hand, what kind of morality are you showing if you're accusing somebody of committing genocide and talking to him for 2 long days in Anchorage in Alaska, and said we had some intensive talks and things like that? That doesn't sound very convincing.
Matthew, Russia and the U.S. actually very quickly decided to restart the nuclear arms agreement after Biden's inauguration. Now, following this accusation against Vladimir Putin, Russia recalled its ambassador from Washington for the first time in decades. Won't this bitter turn in relations make further arms control negotiations more difficult?
No, I think just the opposite, in fact. I mean, my read is that the Russians are probably relieved by this, because now they know, okay, this is the position of the White House. And previously it wasn't clear what the position was going to be. And I think the Chinese are probably also relieved in the sense that they know who they're dealing with and what they're dealing with. And the Russians will look at it very pragmatically. They benefit from the START treaties just as much as the U.S. Nobody wants to, be investing all of this money in nuclear capability. Certainly the Russians don't. I mean, people forget that that Russia itself, as an economy, is roughly the size of Spain. It is not on the same plane as the United States. It is not on the same plane as China. And so this is really actually extending a hand to Russia, saying, look, we'll renew this treaty. And there's no reason that they shouldn't take them up on that. And I think that's also true of the Chinese, because China also has pressures that it has to deal with its domestic population. And the less money they have to spend on nuclear, which costs a lot, the better.
Let me pick up on the point you made about Russia and China being in very different places in terms of their power trajectories. Yep. Our title and much of the media reporting about this new harsh rhetoric, Hang-Shuen, does lump together China and Russia. But the fact is, Russia is a declining power and China is absolutely a rising one. What impact do you think that would have in terms of the response that we're likely to see from China, for example?
I think what we're going to see is that China and Russia is going to be closer. They're pushing them closer together. But China and Russia, they are already cooperating in different things. Like they have they trade weapons, and they already have the kind of relationship. And I think with the harsh rhetoric from the US and then with the West, it's going to push them closer together, even if that might be just symbolic, but it just gives them the chance to stand closer together.
And Malte, one thing that both countries also very much share is insistence that other powers, including multilateral institutions like the United Nations, have no right to meddle in their internal affairs. Is that what Biden essentially is doing here? And are these countries' abuses of human rights ultimately nearly impossible to influence from outside?
The question is, how strong is the language? I mean, the reaction that we just saw from Vladimir Putin to what Biden said was quite telling, because they know each other. Because Biden was in the White House when Obama was president, Barack Obama was president, when the Crimean was annexed and when the war in Ukraine starts and things like this. So, and it was condemned to that time as well by Barack Obama. And in the backyard was Joe Biden saying, yes, what you did was morally condemnable, and so on and so on. So Putin knows him very well and knows what he thinks about those words. And wishing him health is the, I mean, he's clearly appealing to his older age and things like that. So it is kind of very self-assertive reaction to what Biden said.
Matthew, there have been a lot of rounds of sanctions in the past. Now the U.S. is imposing yet another round on Russia. But frankly, so far, neither harsh rhetoric nor sanctions appear to have really had any influence on Russia's behavior. Why should things be any different now?
Well, again, they might not be different in terms of Russia's behavior. It might be different, however, in terms of showing the rest of the world that what Russia is doing or what China is doing is not in order, and there needs to be some kind of reaction to it. And I think that public opinion is very important in these questions. And it does hit, obviously, the individuals against whom the sanctions are targeted. But sanctions also give you a negotiating chip later on. There's something that people forget. There's never or very rarely a case where a country like the United States imposes sanctions on another country and then the other country just sort of, gives up whatever it's doing. But what it does do is that later on in negotiations, we've seen this with Russia, by removing the sanctions, gets you in the negotiation, it allows you to convince them to do something that you don't want them to do. So I think that's how I would look at it. It is not the silver bullet by any means.
Let's talk a little bit about where Europe is in all of this. Biden, in fact, has repeatedly paired his motto that the U.S. is back with the vow to work together with America's European allies. And indeed, earlier this week, the EU joined the U.S., Britain, and Canada in imposing sanctions against China for the first time in 30 years.
As recently as December, the EU signed a new investment agreement with China, to the dismay of the United States. Now it is sanctioning the country for human rights violations against the Muslim Uyghur minority. Independent human rights organizations estimate that 100,000 Uyghurs and other Muslims are being detained and mistreated in camps in Xinjiang. For a long time, the EU's top priority was trade with Beijing. Now, following the example of the US, Brussels is also playing hardball.
We have taken decisive actions against responsible for serious human rights violations and abuses in 6 countries. The sanctions that the Council adopted today concern 11 individuals and 4 entities from China, North Korea, Libya, South Sudan, Eritrea, and Russia.
For their role in persecuting LGBT+ people, Brussels is stepping up sanctions against Russian officials. Most recently, the EU imposed sanctions on Russia over the poisoning of now imprisoned Kremlin opponent Alexei Navalny. By imposing sanctions, the US and the European Union are slowly tightening the screws. But how much further is Europe really willing to go?
Let me put that question to Malte. Malte, in your opening statement, you said that none of the three powers, Russia, China, or the U.S., has a real interest in escalation. But the fact is that is very much a European perspective. Europe in general, and Germany in particular, have repeatedly made it clear that they are very concerned about being forced to essentially take sides in a U.S.-China Cold War, and possibly also in U.S. hostility versus vis-a-vis Russia. Do you think that's what's happening here? Is the EU now, with these latest sanctions against China, essentially being forced to take sides?
In a way, yes. And I would always say, if it's through partnerships or through NATO or through other institutions, there's always a very strong link between European Union and the United States. And even if it's for the security of Europe, I mean, we are still relying on the American nuclear umbrella for that. So there is, and we are democracies that binds us together. We share the same values. The question is the threat of escalation. We have the experience from the Cold War, and we were always afraid about escalating things. And all three countries are members of the United Nations Security Council. All three are nuclear powers, so there is never a military solution for any kind of conflict. So I think that sanctions became just another tool of international diplomacy. It doesn't really hurt a country. It never functions very well, with one exception, that was South Africa. But all other countries, like from Sudan through Libya, through Serbia, all others, it never worked. It will not bring the Chinese Communist Party to collapse.
Let me ask Hang-Shuen if she agrees with that. Yeah. And is there joint action on the part of the U.S. and Europe that could influence China's behavior?
Mm-hmm. I do agree that the sanctions are largely symbolic, because it was just against a few people, which won't bring much effect, really. But I think that the action itself, the symbolic action itself, it's a big step, because for Europe, it was so reluctant to actually take any stance, and as you've already said, it's the first time in 30 years, and I think that's a big step. It's a big decision for them to take. And in terms of to answer your question, if that's going to change China's behavior, I don't think these sanctions can change China's behavior, to be honest. But if the U.S. continues this course, and if they can connect the Western power together, and people who have the same countries, which have the same beliefs, and combine that economic power together, I think that's going to have an effect.
But in this triangle, let's say China on one hand, United States and Europe on the other hand, Europe is the weakest link. So there is a temptation for the Chinese to say, if you want a kind of battle, we go for the weakest link, not for the strong competitor, United States.
Matthew, how far do you think Europe will be willing to go, particularly with that awareness of how dependent it is on China's market?
Well, I think Germany is very dependent on the Chinese market. The rest of Europe is not as dependent on Chinese market. China is the largest trading partner now for the EU, I believe, although it's mainly because they export so much from China. They're not selling as much to China as they are to the United States. For example, the United States is a more important export market for Europe as a whole. So Europe is, as Malte said, very reliant on the U.S. in various ways, especially for its security. I think that the fact that it has kind of come around on China is more a sign that they are accepting the reality as it is. And that's why things like sanctions, I would argue, are important, because it creates moral clarity. And I think as recently as December, when the EU was doing this investment deal with China, there was a feeling of, well, the Chinese, they're not nice to the Uyghurs, but, they're also, the Americans aren't nice to certain people too, and there's sort of bad things going on everywhere, which is, kind of a kind of justification, I think, in a lot of Europeans' minds for continuing on the previous course. That has gone out the window now. So you can see that Biden's approach, the pressure that Blinken is exerting behind the pressure, is already having an effect.
Very briefly, almost out of time, but quickly from you and also from Malte, Nord Stream, bringing it back to Russia. Is it time, if we're talking about serious pressure and working together with the U.S., for Germany to put the gas pipeline Nord Stream, that essentially is a deal with Russia, to rest?
I think it is. I don't think Germany will do it because it has refused to do it for so long.
Malte?
Yes, Germany relies on Nord Stream because they got rid of nuclear power and coal power. So this gas is the only thing that's left to fulfill his needs energy-wise.
So it's not going to happen in your view. Thank you very much to all of you for being with us here today. And thanks to all of you out there for tuning in. See you soon.